Well, everyone, why don't we get started? Good evening and welcome to the fourth online basketball speaker series event held by the New York Carolina Club. My name is David German and I am the chair of the New York Carolina Club. And tonight we are proud to announce that this basketball speaker series has been renamed the Tommy Kearns New York Carolina Club Basketball Speaker Series in honor of Tommy Kearns, UNC class of 1958 and member of the undefeated 1957 UNC National Championship basketball team. Tommy has been a tremendous supporter, not only of the University of North Carolina, but the New York Carolina Club as well. And he's done this for many years, of which we are truly grateful. Before I introduce our guest speaker and interviewer, I want to thank two people who have been instrumental in setting up our event for this evening. A special thanks goes to General Alumni Association Coordinator of Outreach for Alumni, Clubs, and Families, Anna Brooks Wichard, and Brecken Brandstrader of the New York Carolina Club Board of Trustees, whose efforts have been instrumental in making this event happen. This evening, we are delighted to have John Dahl, UNC class of 1986, as our featured speaker. John is Vice President and Executive Producer for original content, films, and special projects at ESPN. Besides his work on the tournament, he was an executive producer on the Emmy-winning film series about Michael Jordan, The Last Dance. His work as an executive producer of the ESPN series 30 for 30 has resulted in Academy, Emmy, and Peabody Awards, and in his illustrious career, he has been the winner of 3 Peabody and 10 Emmy Awards. Hosting the discussion will be UNC History Associate Professor Matthew Andrews. Professor Andrews is a highly regarded historian with an interest in the links between sports and American history and culture. The Daily Tar Heel has designated him Best Professor 3 times and have cited several of his courses as Best UNC class over the years. Furthermore, I urge you to check out his engaging sports podcast, Agony of Defeat, that discusses the intersection of sports, politics, and history, and can be heard on many audio outlets, including Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spotify. The New York Carolina Club thanks John Dahl and Professor Matthew Andrews for their time in doing this online event. So let us begin, and I now introduce to you Professor Matthew Andrews.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining. This is a fun way for me down here in Chapel Hill to spend about an hour, and I'll be interviewing John. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I think we're going to talk for a little while, and then I'd love to get to your questions. I think a lot of you, your ACC chops are a little thicker than mine, so I think it'll be interesting to hear your questions as well. So yeah, so I teach courses here at UNC on sports and politics and history. I'm teaching a course right now called Race, Basketball, and the American Dream, where we use basketball to explore race relations in the United States in the 20th and 21st century. And I'm really excited to talk to John. And John, I know you're the star here. I just want to say one quick thing about where I'm coming from with this project. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to college at UCLA. We were talking about Lou Alcindor a second ago. And when I started college, the Pac-10 didn't even have a conference tournament. There was no postseason conference tournament at all. They started one up when I was a sophomore in 1987. And it only lasted for 3 years because nobody went, nobody cared. And then it went away for about 10 years and then it came back, and still no one really goes to the Pac-10 tournament, Pac-12 tournament. They hold it in Las Vegas now, trying to lure a few more people in. So maybe it's going to catch on. So when I moved here to Chapel Hill in the fall of 1999, I didn't understand the phenomenon of the postseason conference basketball tournament. And look, I knew it was a big deal. I grew up in the 80s and I saw all the ACC finals and remember them vividly. But I didn't understand what a huge deal it was till I guess that first tournament when, as a graduate student, I needed to get some photocopying done in the history office, and I walked in, and nobody was working on the first day of the tournament. The lights were off, everyone had televisions on. Grown-ups were watching sports at noon on a work day, and I was just sort of flabbergasted by this. Same thing as I walk down Franklin Street, everywhere you go, the television is on. My kids would come home from school and I'd say, "What did you do today?" And they said, "We watched the ACC tournament." And I'm thinking, what? That's not what you're supposed to do in school. And they said, no, it was math class. So we would calculate shooting percentages as we walked the game. And I just kind of fell in love with the way it was so integrated into the whole environment here. So much so that a few years later, when Roy Williams kind of said he didn't care that much about the ACC tournament, he wants to win the NCAA tournament, I was part of that chorus of voices that was shaking their fists and saying, no, this is so special. This is not what it's like in the rest of the country. So thank you so much for bringing this to us. I have so many things that I want to say, so many moments that I find so interesting. John, to get your voice in here, maybe you could just start by introducing yourself. And I'm sure a lot of people know this, but give us your ACC basketball story, where you grew up, who you grew up rooting for, where you went to school. Maybe we could start that way.
All right. Well, I grew up actually in Maryland. I was born in Silver Spring, Maryland, and grew up in Rockville till I was 9.5 years old. So I actually was a huge Maryland fan. I was a diehard Maryland basketball fan. Lefty Drizel just captivated me. And, I continued that passion. Honestly, with Maryland, I was still a Maryland fan. Even while I was at Carolina, I would still root for Maryland too. I couldn't help it. I mean, that was part of my entire upbringing. And what happened was I moved to South Florida for 3 years, and I got out of the ACC footprint. And that was a very difficult time for me because I couldn't watch the games. This is way before streaming and cable. And it was SEC games that we got in South Florida. And I would just try to tune in some ACC games at night, on a 50,000 watt station. I'd hope to dial in a game. So those 3 years were tough for me. But then I moved to Charlotte when I was 12 and a half. And now I'm right in the heart of it on Tobacco Road. And that just further fueled my love of ACC basketball. And it continued even, I went to Duke basketball camp a couple of years, Bill Foster's camp 1 year. I won the Tate Armstrong Lookalike Award. Because at one time, believe it or not, I had long blonde locks. They're long gone now, but I had them, and I had a good outside shot for a time. So Tate Armstrong, long blonde hair, outside shot. I took that with great pride to win that award. And then the next year, I actually went to Mike Krzyzewski's first ever camp at Duke. And we learned how to spell his name on the fly. I can still spell it, immediately. KRZYZWSKI. I mean, it just got ingrained. And I didn't love his camp, quite honestly, because he wanted me to play defense. And I had no interest in defense. I wanted to shoot the ball. So that was my last year of Coach K's camp, my last year of camp period, quite honestly. But I ended up at North Carolina, which was honestly the perfect school for me because I was very interested in sports media since I was a little kid. It wasn't just playing sports. I love to write about sports. I love to talk about sports. Anything related to sports, I was in. And so I thought North Carolina would be a great school for me. And I initially eyed the journalism program. But then when I got to UNC, my best friend from high school and best friend to this day, Greg Mitchie, who's absolutely on here tonight, he was in radio, TV, and motion pictures. And he basically introduced me to that. And I got into the RTV MP program, which I loved. And I did a lot of part-time work during my years at Carolina. I wrote for the Chapel Hill newspaper my freshman year. I wrote sports for them, for Ron Green Jr., Elliot Warnock, Dragan Mihalovic, who went on to be a producer for 60 Minutes, wrote with me. And then I was a PA my sophomore year with the Tar Heel Sports Network. And there was this guy, I don't know if you've heard of him. His name was Michael Jordan. Yeah, you remember that guy? He was playing his what turned out to be last year at Carolina. So I was at almost every Carolina game during his last year there. And that was just, what an experience that was. And so I continued radio and TV work right through college. So it was just to be at Carolina, to be firsthand right there as a witness to ACC basketball. It was just like a dream for me.
I was at the Dean Dome last night for the Syracuse game, and it's a wonderful place. But whenever people come from out of town, I take them into Carmichael, and just let them know this is where Michael Jordan played, and this is where Sam Perkins played. And I'm envious of those experiences that I didn't get to experience. So as David was talking about, you've done a lot in this business. You're part of the wonderful Last Dance program that really kind of saved me and all of us during the early days of the pandemic. So I want to say thank you. There was sports to watch finally when that came on. Michael Jordan is obviously, though he's a Carolina guy, he's a national figure. The whole nation sort of claims ownership over Michael Jordan. And so I'm guessing that getting the approval or the funding for something like that wasn't very difficult. But I'm wondering what the reaction was when you told people you wanted to do something on the ACC tournament. Did anyone think that this was too regional of a story? Did you have a hard time getting backing for this program?
It's interesting. Often when I come up with an idea for something, it takes a while to convince people to see it the way I see it. And that was not the case here. What happened was I was leading a project on college football's 150th anniversary called College Football 150. And it's something I've been working on for years. And it related to a documentary I'd overseen called The Book of Manning. And I saw the 100 decals on the helmets of Archie Manning and his teammates. I'm like, what's the 100 about? And then I researched, and before you know it, I was starting a project years in advance for the 150th anniversary. Well, during that, we did an 8-part, 12-hour film on SEC football called Saturdays in the South. It was a history of SEC football. And I loved working on it. And a director by the name of Fritz Mitchell did it. And I was interested in doing something like that for the ACC. And what happened was we, announced that we were going to be starting the ACC Network at ESPN, starting in August of 2019. Well, the year before that, we knew we were going to be starting the network. And I'm like, we should do something big for the network. And so I would meet with a really good friend of mine, a colleague named Aaron Cohen. He's a tremendous writer. He's won like 10 Emmys for his writing, and he's a really good producer too. And so Aaron and I would meet at PJ Clark's in Manhattan in the summer of 18 and starting to come up with, an approach for the ACC. And I said, well, with the ACC, what sets the ACC apart is basketball, and it's the tournament. That tournament was unlike anything else we had seen in college basketball, and the ACC had such a role in shaping the future of college basketball through that and other things. I'm like, I think we should tell the story through the prism of the tournament. And so Aaron and I began working on a treatment, and really had it in good shape by the end of the year, by the end of 18. I went in to pitch it one of the last days of January in 2019 to Rosalind Durant, who oversaw our college networks, and Stacy McCollum, who was going to be leading our ACC network efforts. And I got to tell you, that was like the easiest pitch meeting I've ever done, because I just laid it out. We had the vision. And after the meeting, I'm like, we should do this. Let's do this. So they didn't have the money. Nobody had the money at that time set aside for it. But it's like, we're going to find the money. We got to do this. So then after that, my next call was to John Hawk, who I'd worked with on 30 for 30, Survive and Advance. He did the NC State 30 for 30. He did the Celtics Lakers Best of Enemies, multi-parter. John has done so much fantastic work of Miracles Men, you name it. And I'm like, John, I called him from a trip to Disney World with my family. I called him from the Delta Lounge. I'm like, John, we got to do this. Will you do this? Because there are very few people that I would trust with multi-parts. It's really hard to pull off a multi-part documentary series. And John was like, I'm in. So sent him the treatment. And before you know it, we were making a deal, and off we went. We announced it at the ACC tournament 3 years ago.
I think find so rewarding watching this. And again, I said this earlier, but for those of you just joining, I've just finished episode 6. Wasn't able to watch 7 and 8 last night. I'm looking forward to 9 and 10. And so it's just got the one with Michael Jordan and the cardiac pack, and what an incredible story that was. I'm so struck by the footage that you have. And I guess I'm starting to learn this about myself. I'm apparently a visual learner, because I've read a lot of these stories before. When I moved here, I tried to kind of learn the lore of the ACC, and I read all of the books, but I didn't really kind of get them until I saw them on film. So I want to thank you for that. I mean, seeing Larry Miller's game and seeing Art Heyman's game, and actually seeing McMillan and Burleson playing against each other is just kind of imprinted on me. Where did you get the footage, and how hard was it to get the footage, and how fun was it just looking through what I assume was days and days of ACC basketball footage?
Well, credit to John Hawk and his team, Larry Weitzman, Jim Poteretz, Phil Armando, you name it. They did a great job of researching the footage. He hired a researcher to help look into that. I love, sports history. And I love to go to YouTube and try to find old games, like broadcasts of old games from the 60s, 70s, 80s. I just can't get enough of that. And so I've got a passion for it. And I tell you, the schools were very helpful, particularly NC State. They were really good in terms of having some material that we didn't know existed, including the Super Bowl Sunday game, which is featured in episode 4. Maryland, NC State, I still lived in the DC area at the time. I remember that, Washington was in the Super Bowl that day against the Miami Dolphins, who were going for an undefeated season. That was a big day in DC. And they found like the whole film footage from the game. He found that Lefty Driesell documentary that was being shot. And I don't know that it ever aired, but he found all that material. Just great, shoe leather detective work to track that down. It takes a long time. It can be an arduous process, but it really pays off because, like I feel the same way. I had those ACC books. I've been carrying around these ACC basketball books since the 80s, Illustrated History of the ACC and the ACC basketball tournament and all this. And now to have it come to life through the footage, it's just magic.
Yeah, it sure is. You talk about the early footage from the Everett Case years is just, it's actually the film itself is just beautiful to look at. The Technicolor or whatever it is, the game's just, it resonates. There were so many stories that I would imagine ACC diehards know, people who grew up in the ACC know, but I didn't know. So I'm kind of an insider and an outsider. I'm an insider in the sense that I study race and basketball, and I know the general history of basketball, but I did not grow up in North Carolina. I did not grow up watching the ACC tournament. The Kevin Joyce jump ball, for South Carolina against North Carolina, that was a story I didn't know. I knew about Bones McKinney, but I didn't realize sort of what a terrifying figure he was, stalking the sidelines, what a madman he was. And Wally Walker, and apologies to UVA fans, to me, Wally Walker growing up, he was the white guy on the Supersonics. And when I heard what he did at the University of Virginia in 1976, I had no idea. I had no idea Al Wood at UNC scored 39 points in the Final Four in 1981. These stories are all new to me. Was there any story that you didn't know that you learned that you took great pleasure in having that story being revealed to you while doing this research?
Oh yeah, because my experience at the ACC was a lot of my childhood. So like the 70s and the 80s, I was just immersed in it, But before that, I knew far less, quite honestly, and definitely like in the first decade, the 50s, the origin story of how the ACC was originally formed out of the Southern Conference in 1953, and then they start playing 54. I learned a ton about Everett Case working on this. And, he is the father of the ACC tournament, brought that out of the Southern Conference tournament. And so you talk about the film footage. It's incredible what we had out of the NC State Archives, color footage from the first ever ACC tournament final. It's just gold. So I learned a lot about every case, really that victory in '65 that was dedicated to him. He had to leave early in the season because of his battle with cancer, and what that meant to him, and them hoisting him on their shoulders to cut down the nets, and then naming the award in his honor. I really didn't appreciate any of that until working on this project.
One of the things that I think, look, you have the great footage, and yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's color footage. That must be so rare from the mid 1950s. But you have the footage, but you have the interviews. And I was constantly impressed and kind of amazed at how you got these players to open up and to talk about these moments. Bobby Cremins, reliving the pain of his failure at South Carolina. Mo Howard of Maryland, just with tears in his eyes, talking about not taking that shot. And I don't blame him with a 7-footer with his arm up right in front of him, but he still clearly believes that he should have taken the shot and is devastated by it. I don't know to what extent you were involved in the interviews, but I'm just wondering, as someone who sometimes does oral history, how do you get people to open up like that? How long did you have to talk to them before they were willing to relive? And many times, look, people can always relive the wonderful moments. I just saw Derek Whittenberg reliving the 83. Yeah, sure, that's easy. But Mo Howard and Bobby Cremins talking about the pain. How did you make that happen?
Well, I was involved with the selection to a degree of who we're going to try to interview, but credit to John Hawk and Larry Weitzman and Jim Potteritz and the producers they hired to do the interviews, because they just did a phenomenal job. I agree, of getting people to open up. Derek Whittenberg played a huge role in helping book interviews for us. Derek was a real force in helping line up those interviews. And keep in mind, we were doing much of this shooting during a pandemic. And so it really made it a challenge to work around that to get these interviews done. And over 160 original interviews were done for this project. That's, to me, it's incredible to have that many interviews while you're shooting around a pandemic. And I agree, like Mo Howard, the first time I saw that rough cut, that one was especially personal to me, being such a Maryland fan growing up. I love Mo Howard. I love John Lucas. I love Len Elmore and Tom McMillan and Jim O'Brien and all those guys. And, those are the real finds. When you can get the ones you've heard from before, like Michael Jordan per se. And Michael was fantastic in The Last Dance. He was just absolutely fantastic. Yeah. But when you can get somebody like Mo Howard that we really haven't heard from, in decades, and it's so raw, like he talks about it like it happened last week. And to see that footage, again, the footage research by the Hawk team, to have the moment that he's talking about where his father comes up from behind and is, consoling him on the bench, you actually get to see that. And then he's talking about it. It sounds like for the first time. Yeah. And the way that tear comes down his cheek, it's so natural. It just comes out because he's thinking of his dad and how much he loved his dad and how much he was hurting in that moment. That's what makes a series like this. When you hear John Lucas still mad that Mo didn't take the shot. You hear Mo trash talking Len Elmore about, I didn't, give up 38 points. My guy didn't score 38 points on me, and on and on. That's what really sets apart a series like this. And, we had it again, episode 8 last night with Shaman Williams, the way he talked about Dean Smith, it was so personal to him. And it just was captivating. The first time I saw that first rough cut, I was just blown away by the way Shaman opened up, the way King Rice was still trash talking Phil Henderson in episode 7, Dave Odom, developing that character, Dave as a kid going to the ACC tournament. He told you exactly where he sat, listening to the games on the radio. Then he just appears here and there at different points. And then the big payoff in episode 8 with the Wake Forest story, and the way he talked about those memories, they can never be taken away from him. that to me is what makes a series like this, when people are willing to open up and go there, the way Charlie Scott opened up about his experiences in the 60s. That's ultimately what makes a series work.
I want to thank you for, a couple of things. Really highlighting that 1974 game between NC State and Maryland. You know, I've always kind of heard the greatest game ever played, and now I'm semi-convinced of it. One of the things that I thought watching that, realizing, is that the referees had no way of making sense of the athleticism of the players all of a sudden. I mean, a couple of those goaltending calls were great blocks, but they were so high above the rim that the referees just didn't know what to do with it. Speaking of people,
used to call walking too. Like they would call walking when it wasn't walking. Michael Jordan would do a great fake, and they would call traveling, because the officials a lot of times weren't ready, to your point, Matt, for that athleticism. I mean, those were absolutely clean blocks in the Maryland NC State game. There's just no doubt about it.
I would agree, and I'm not a Maryland guy, so yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm glad you mentioned Charles Scott and how Charles Scott kind of opened up about what he loved, but also didn't love about Carolina. And I want to come back to that. I think that's an important story. I'm thinking of some of the people who were in this that I was surprised that they were in it, and some of the people who I was kind of hoping they would be in it and weren't. I thought maybe you could say something about this. I was surprised that Ralph Sampson agreed to be interviewed for this. The great Ralph Sampson, supposed to be the greatest ACC player of all time, doesn't even win the ACC tournament. Was that a tough get?
I don't think that was surprisingly overly tough to get. Ralph has talked at times about his experiences, and I was so glad he did it, because there's a 3-time national player of the year, let alone ACC player of the year. And yet he's got to talk about 4 years and no ACC championships. And that hurts to this day. And I'm just so pleased that he was willing to sit down and talk with us.
Yeah, well, I was impressed with his participation. There were 2 people who I was hoping to hear from. John Roach of South Carolina. And I know of him mainly because of the controversy between him and Charles Scott for the Player of the Year in 1969. And then, of course, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this with the UNC crowd, but the guy who I think is the greatest ACC player of all time, from what I understand, David Thompson. David Thompson wasn't part of that. How did that work? Did you? I assume you reached out to Roach and Thompson for this.
Oh yeah, multiple times. And Derek is a cousin of David. Sometimes it's just you don't catch a person at the point in life where they want to go there. There can be different reasons for it. We certainly reached out to John Roach multiple times. Like Bobby Cremins even tried to help at some point, and he just decided he didn't want to do it. You're going to deal with that. Any big project, there's going to be a few people that say no for whatever reason, and you just try to respect it. You do everything you can to get them to say yes, but ultimately, you just got to move on. And that's what we did. And I think, like with South Carolina, I really wanted to tell that story very much. Because one of my first memories as a kid of watching a Maryland game was against South Carolina. My parents let me stay up late on a Saturday night to watch Maryland, South Carolina, 1971. And I was 7 years old. It was my birthday. And in South Carolina, I was like number 2 in the country. And Maryland held the ball because that was their best strategy. There's no shot clock, no 3-point line at that time. And I hated it. I hated holding the ball. I didn't like stalling. And I know, for some people, love the 4 corners. That's maybe not what they want to hear, but I just didn't like it. I always wanted a shot clock in basketball. And so I was so upset, I just went right to bed. I didn't even finish the game. Like my dad wrote down the score on his Gold Bond Building Products notepad for me when I woke up the next morning. And it was like 31-30, Maryland won in overtime or something, But I always thought it was so interesting that South Carolina was in the conference and then left. And it's like, why did they leave? And I really was happy with how we told that story. And I thought Bobby Cremins was just amazing, the way he opened up about the pain of 1970. Yeah. We joke amongst ourselves, like we still want to know more. Who was that woman at that, Waffle House or wherever that was?
Right.
What happened there? But you go with the Kevin Joyces and the Lee Dedmans. You can clearly see Lee Dedman still doesn't like South Carolina. Like, he's not kidding. He doesn't like South Carolina 50 years later. You just go to your strengths in that situation, and that's what we did.
Yeah, and not having David Thompson was one thing, but again, Mo Howard was absolutely priceless. You got
the Maryland guys were great, and Tom Burleson was fantastic.
Yeah,
and so was Phil Spence. I love Phil Spence. He was hilarious, and Monty Tao was very good. And so it's like, that episode was particularly personal to me, having been a Maryland fan as a little kid. And I was really happy with that episode. Even from the first rough cut, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I've always dreamed of, a story like this. And that's part of the larger, thought process we had about how we laid out the documentary from one episode to the next. It wasn't equal. It wasn't always like the same amount of years. We varied it. And we devoted an entire episode 4, to 2 years. Right. 73, 74, NC State, Maryland, because that rivalry was so critical to the ACC's future, let alone their president at that time, that we felt like it merited that. And so, then, you just decide, where do you start? Where do you end an episode? There's an art to it at some point. And you'll notice, like, we're up to episode 9 now. There's just 2 episodes left, and we're only through 1997,
Right.
The last 20 plus years are covered in just the final 2 episodes, which I think, especially as we finish the episodes, I do believe was the right call. I think it's more fascinating to dive in with a little more time and distance.
Okay, so this opens up a lot of questions that I have, and it's great that people are starting to put some questions in here, and please do. I'll get to these questions in just a little bit. From a kind of professional point of view, look, as a basketball fan, I was super excited for this documentary, but as someone who teaches a course on race and basketball, I was very curious about how this documentary was going to deal with the issue of race and the desegregation of the ACC. And right away in episode 1, you call segregation the unspoken shame of the ACC. And I read books about Carolina basketball that talks about the team in the 1950s and teams going against Wilt Chamberlain, and they don't even mention the fact that the UNC basketball program was actually segregated at this time. So I was glad that the documentary took that on. Something that I've always wondered, and I'm just, you as a historian of the ACC, maybe you could help me with this. I was a little surprised that there was no discussion of the Dixie Classic in the Everett Cases kind of basketball tournament from, was it 49 to 1960, I guess. And when I look at the Dixie Classic, and when I talk about the Dixie Classic in my race and basketball class, I really talk about it as an expression of Southern pride at this time. And when I say at this time, I mean white Southern pride in the 1950s. You've got the Confederate flags on the brochures. It's the Dixie Classic. Dixie is being played as the teams come running in. There's that us against them mentality at the Dixie Classic, where the Big Four play the outside schools and they don't let teams with black players come right away. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think the ACC tournament in the early years kind of had that white Southern pride enthusiasm, but behind it, like, again, which I clearly see being manifested in the Dixie Classic at this same time. We talk about the 1957 team and 4 Catholics and a Jew and all that, and we celebrate the New Yorkness of the team and the diversity. But in the pictures you showed, when that team comes back to Raleigh-Durham, it's number 1 for Dixie, and it's Rebel Yanks. I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the Dixie Classic, I'm familiar with it. I've done a documentary on Oscar Robertson, actually, for Sports Century, when we did the 50 greatest athletes, and I did like 8 of those 50 greatest athlete documentaries, including the final one on Jordan and Babe Ruth. And so, I would talk to Oscar about that. I think here in the end, like, we're just very focused on the ACC tournament, and we're going through nearly 70 years of the ACC tournament. And so that was our North Star. And like, at times we're telling background stories that lead you back to the tournament. It's not like just tournament recaps, it couldn't be that. we did feel like you had to get in a little bit to the culture of it in a variety of ways. And I think ultimately we just decided that the first episode, we needed to focus more on Everett Case and the 57 Carolina team with Lenny Rosenbluth and Tommy Kearns. And in episode 2, the other challengers to NC State and Case. I mean, remember the tournament was played every year at NC State's Reynolds Coliseum. You know, they had such a home court advantage. It was incredible. And just felt it was important to establish how did basketball become so important to the South, you know, to the Carolinas and the ACC footprint. And that was Everett Case. Everett Case took what was supposed to be a football conference and made it a basketball conference because of his time in Indiana. So I think we were very focused on Indiana, but we did want to send a message right from the beginning of that there were no African Americans in the ACC at this time. And that was very important, we thought, to establish that. And we just decided ultimately to build it to an episode 3 where we would devote episode 3. Hey, it seems like the ACC tournament's doing okay first decade, but you know what? They're missing one thing that is just wrong. And that is a complete lack of African-American players. And I felt like the most important interview of the entire series was Charlie Scott. There's other stories we can tell. We talked about NC State, Maryland, 74, all the people that could tell that story. But we cannot really tell the story of Charlie Scott without Charlie Scott. We needed him. And credit to Derek Wittenberg for helping convince Charlie to do the interview. And I appreciate Charlie showing the trust in all of us to open up and tell his story. And then you get like, you know, Billy Jones from Maryland and Charlie Davis and Al Hartley. They were willing to sit down and really tell you what they went through. They told specific stories of what they experienced. And without them being willing to do that, I mean, how do we really do that story justice? So it was essential. It always was important to us. And I got to tell you, I thought Bob McAdoo's story was one of the surprises for me of the entire series, because I knew about McAdoo, but I never really thought of his story for what he went through, and that the ACC schools really wouldn't recruit him because he was Black. And, you know, he ended up having to go to junior college. You know, they were skeptical of him in a way they never should have been. I mean, Bob McAdoo is one of the 75 greatest players in NBA history.
Right.
And yet he couldn't get an ACC school to look at him. And then Dean took him as a junior college transfer, which was rare at that time. And just the way Bob McAdoo talked about race in his relationship with Dean Smith, I thought was so revealing and so authentic. The story he told about Dean saying, you know, he could date his daughter, you know, if he wanted to. And it's like Bob McAdoo said, I'm not looking to date his daughter, but just him saying that was so profoundly powerful. And so I thought that was a great story too, to tell in that and just like establish where the ACC started and now where it was going to go. It needed to fix that problem, pure and simple.
I appreciate that. And I appreciated the way, once again, I appreciated that Billy Jones was in there, because certainly a lot of people in Chapel Hill think that Charlie Scott desegregated the ACC, and that's obviously not true. And I think it was really important having Charlie Scott, like I said, talk about his experiences here. All right, sometimes talking about race can be controversial, but here comes the most controversial issue of the entire night, I think. I know this is the wrong crowd to bring this up with. I often make the wrong decision in my life, though, so I'm just going to go with it anyway. I got to say, after watching this documentary, at least the parts that I've seen, I think I start to get the anyone but Carolina mindset in the ACC a little bit more. I always just assumed it was pure jealousy, pure and simple. And then there are these stories out here about that Wake Forest pass hitting the scoreboard in Greensboro. I think that was in 1975. And I realized it was Billy Packer, a Wake Forest guy, telling us that ball definitely did not hit the scoreboard. But it sounds to me like the ball didn't hit the scoreboard. But the thing that just drove me nuts, and you just alluded to it, and maybe we can get a conversation going about this if people want to weigh in the chat, what did you describe it as? You described for other teams, the four corners would loom like the shadow of the Grim Reaper. And that's the way I felt every time Dean Smith in this documentary holds up four fingers. I just yelled, no, I can't do it. I vividly remember being 13 years old when he went to the four corners in the 82 final against Virginia, and even being in California. That was a must-watch basketball game. We were all watching Jordan and Perkins against. I had no idea about that 1979 game against Duke, where the Tar Heels hold the ball for 12 minutes and the score at halftime is Duke 7, UNC nothing. What in God's name is going on here? I was going to ask you to defend Dean Smith in the four corners, but it sounds like you're equally frustrated with that basketball strategy as I am.
I'm not going to defend the four corners. I told you about my best friend of 40 years, Greg Mitchie. He's on this tonight. Greg was at that game. He was at Cameron Indoor for that 7-0 halftime score. I think I was at a UNCC game that night in Charlotte. Look, I get it. I get why Dean Smith, would go for that approach at times. I mean, certainly with Phil Ford. Like when he had Phil Ford running it, it was really it became offensive. It became an attack, and then Phil Ford was like unfair, and he was brilliant at it. But come on, when you're holding the ball and you have no points at halftime, that's just to me, that's just not basketball. I'm sorry. And so, this speaks for me, Matt, of a larger point, my feeling and approach to this series, which is, look, I went to North Carolina, and I take great pride in that. And in my degree at Carolina, I'm thrilled that I went to UNC. But I also came from a perspective of just loving the ACC, being a Maryland fan growing up, having gone to Duke camp. So like I always rooted for the ACC, and that was important to me. When they got to the NCAA tournament, I would just root for the ACC schools. And so I try to, I take pride in my job. When I'm a journalist, when I'm telling stories, like allegiances have to go to the side. I got to do my job, and I got to be objective, and I got to be fair to everybody. And I take immense pride in that. And it's very, very important to me to not show favoritism in that. And so like with Dean Smith, I would argue that our portrayal of Dean Smith in this series is authentic. It's human. He's a human being. He wasn't perfect. He was brilliant in so many ways, and he was amazing to his players. The relationship that his players have with him is to be admired and respected to the nth degree. But I also did appreciate when Jack Marin is like saying, he's talking about the 21-20 game in the 66 ACC tournament. He's talking about, that was Dean. It's just like, he's just disgusted with them. Or when John Sally last night is talking about, Dean Smith didn't recruit him, and he's looking over at Dean after he gets the clinching hoop in the 85 ACC final. Or John Roach, is talking trash to Dean, and Dedman's mad at John Roach for doing that. Like, to me, that's what makes Dean Smith a human being. It makes him real. So that when you get to the story of Shammond Williams, and he's talking about this personal relationship, to me, it feels like, wow, it just pops, because we haven't sat there for episode after episode talking about Dean's great, Dean's great, Dean's great. We give a platform for those players who went up against him and wanted to prove him wrong, who, he didn't recruit him or whatever. So I think that's just really important when you're storytelling, to embrace the gray areas of human beings, and not try to make things just black and white. The gray area is where the best stories are.
Oh, that's awesome. That's fascinating. And then I think maybe this is the last question that I'll ask, and then I'll start reading the ones from the chat here. Like I said, I'm only through episode 6, and I'm wondering about a potential theme in later episodes. Do you explore, and you just mentioned how the last episode looks at 20 years of ACC tournaments. Do you explore the question, or do you have thoughts on whether the ACC tournament is still meanful, in the way that it once was, in an era of expansion, and with schools as far south as Miami, and you got Syracuse, and you have Notre Dame. I know the people up in Brooklyn who have tickets to the games, or up in New York, tickets next week, want to hear that it's still the preeminent conference tournament and it's special. In your mind, or do you talk about this with expansion? Is the ACC tournament as special as it once was?
For me, it is. Times have changed. Like you're never going to have the era again where for like 21 years, from 54 through 74, one NCAA tournament bid on the line, and it was the champion of the tournament. That's a pressure cooker. The intensity of that was unreal. And I felt it as a fan. I can only imagine what players and coaches felt like, let alone administrators as well. Well, we're not going back to that. The NCAA is not going to go back to a 24 or 32 team field. Those days are gone. So, with that comes evolution. And I think the event continued to be popular and continued to grow and continued to be a must-have ticket even after the NCAA started opening up its field more and more and more. We do touch on it in the final episode, in episode 10. I think without giving too much away, we really do focus on the pandemic, COVID suddenly shutting down the ACC tournament in the middle of it. And look, what we were going through as human beings in the world supersedes anything in sports, of course. But for people who had grown used to having that every year and suddenly it's gone, that was tough. And for us, that was like the end of this story of the 10 parts in 10 hours. Then we bring it back to kind of, you get a sense in the finale of that final segment what the ACC tournament has meant to people. And I'll just let them speak for themselves. And I will say, that when you hear them talk about it, I think it's every bit as meaningful, just in different ways than it was in the early days.
Yeah. That's when you knew that the pandemic was serious, when the ACC tournament was canceled. That was our sign. So I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat here, and thanks to those of you who've been staying in here with us. And Greg wants to know that looking at all the old raw footage from the tournament games, was there a player who maybe you didn't appreciate at the time, and then kind of seeing his game on film that you came to appreciate in hindsight? Yeah,
it's a great question. And my answer would be Charlie Scott, because I saw Charlie Scott as a kid and he was already in the NBA. See, I don't remember him as a college player. It was a little before my time. And looking at that footage, it just blew me away how great Charlie Scott was. And now think about what he was dealing with, the pressure he was under. Like he said it in episode 3, Carolina wins, Charlie Scott loses. So the 68 team with Larry Miller, great team that went all the way to the NCAA final. They win it easily. But 69, now Larry Miller's gone. And if they don't win, because he's African-American, he knows a lot of people are just going to blame him.
Yeah.
And what he did in the 69 final against Duke, down double digits in the second half, Dick Grubar has gotten hurt. And he just took over. He's like, give me the ball. And he scores 28 points in the second half. No shot clock, no three-point line. 28 points on just twos with no shot clock, with one missed shot. Incredible. So seeing that footage, I would tear up seeing that, quite honestly, at what he was doing. So yeah, you do gain an appreciation for certain players through the old footage. And Charlie Scott, stood out to me.
To that point, you're again the Last Dance about Michael Jordan. I wasn't alone here. I was in on Michael Jordan almost from the very start. The first time certainly when he started his sophomore year at UNC. But watching the montage of college footage that you put together about Michael Jordan, I was blown away by how much better he was. I don't remember him being that much better than everyone else, but that footage that you showed of him in college, I guess I get it why Elijah Wan went first, but after watching that footage, I'm not sure I do. He was again, it wasn't in this documentary, it was in your other one. That was the footage that absolutely blew me away.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when we were at Carolina, I still feel like we felt like we knew how great Jordan could be more than like the country. Even, because again, there's not streaming yet. Cable's just starting to take off. So people aren't seeing him the way we were seeing him up close at Carolina. And, Michael was like my first interview at the Chapel Hill newspaper my freshman year, one-on-one with Michael at Carmichael Auditorium Court at the start of fall practice. It was right after, it was like months after he'd hit the shot to beat Georgetown. And there was, Michael was such a team player at Carolina. He totally bought into Dean Smith, loved Dean Smith. And so, the old joke used to go around, who's the only person that can hold Michael under 20 points a game? Dean Smith, But Dean Smith made Michael Jordan a better player, because he developed all those important things in his game, the defense, the passing, everything that Michael brought to the NBA. It's not just scoring and dunking. He made him a better player. So definitely Michael, and also to me, Len Bias, looking at the old footage, and I was a Maryland fan, and I was at Len Bias's game at Carolina in '86. That was Len Bias's senior year, and Maryland won in overtime, and Len Bias just took over. It was incredible. And I just had even forgotten a little bit, and we did a 30 for 30 on Len Bias. And I still have forgotten just how incredible he was starting to become in '84. And that was my first ACC tournament. I was at the '84 ACC tournament. It's the first one I ever went to in person, working for the Tar Heel Sports Network. And that was apropos because, I was there for Carolina, but you broadcast all the games, and Carolina loses in the semis, gets upset by Duke. And I'm there. We were broadcasting the championship game, Duke, Maryland, and I'm there to see Lefty win his first ACC championship. That felt fitting that I could witness that. But yeah, the footage, again, to me, that helps, it's the interviews, it's the footage, it's making it all just kind of the history come alive. And that's what attracted me to wanting to do this story too, was this had never been done, and I like to take big swings with projects, and I like to try to do things that have never been done. And nobody had ever done this on the ACC tournament, ACC basketball history, not remotely like this. And so that, to me, I took that as a challenge, and then as a tremendous privilege. We got to get this right. I think about all the writers that I was around and broadcasters, and thinking about those people over the decades, and thinking, man, I want to make them proud. People who are around the ACC for a long time and feel like, wow, ESPN did this project and they really told it the right way. That was something that was super important to me throughout this.
To go back to UNC and Charlie Scott, Rob here was wondering about his memory at the end of an ACC tournament where thousands of white fans, UNC fans, chanting "Great Scott, great Scott, great Scott." Is that something that came up in your research? Or I think Charlie Scott maybe alludes to that a little bit in that story that he tells.
At the barbershop. Yeah. And that's, to me, the beauty of sports. It's why I love sports. Quite honestly, one reason is that it breaks down barriers. When it's doing that, it's just pure magic, and I love that about how everybody, it's about the games, it's about winning and losing. And you put all those other things down that seem to divide us every day. And I think that, that helps when Charlie Scott is the way he is, the man that he is, the player that he was. It helps.
Yeah. I think Martin asked a really interesting question here about being in the business that you're in, about the extent to which the impact of your Tar Heel credentials sort of shapes the conversations or opens doors I guess I'm thinking about all of the students that I come across all the time who want to go into sports journalism, who want to go into sports television, and to what extent has that UNC name been an asset in your career?
I think it's helped some, for sure, especially at the beginning. I could have written for the Charlotte Observer. I got an offer from Frank Barrows. There was a story told about Frank Barrows talking about why Dean Smith had never won the national championship that John Feinstein tells. Well, Frank Barrows, a few years after that story, offered me a job at the Charlotte Observer. And it's because of my, part-time work there, going back to senior in high school. I was an intern at the Charlotte News, and I wrote part-time for the News and Observer in college. Ron Green was a huge mentor to me, and Ron Green Jr. And I turned it down for no money. I took an unpaid internship at CNN Sports in Atlanta, and I think the Carolina degree and having graduated with honors helped me get that internship. And I worked for free for 4 months at CNN Sports. And CNN at that time had a thriving sports department that was the rival to ESPN sports department. And so I think that got me in the door at that time. And then from that point, as I start to establish my career, it's more about what I'm doing at that particular place. But Carolina is a degree that travels. My niece went to Carolina. She's class of 2011. And that's a degree that you can move anywhere in the country, honestly, anywhere in the world, and it's respected and recognized.
Yeah. Have you gotten any feedback from viewers, speaking of Carolina, that it's too Carolina centric, or it's too focused on NC State? Are the Clemson fans shaking their fist and say, "Where are the Tigers?" In this story? I'm just sort of curious.
Fans, stay tuned. Episode 9. I've been wanting to do this, and John Hawk and his team would tell you. I keep saying we got to do Clemson at some point. Hard luck Clemson story. Come on, we got to do that. And it's in episode 9. We use the fact that Clemson makes the 2008 final as the entry point, because it's the first time they even made the final in 46 years. Yeah, it's like, we're going to do a flashback. We're going to go back and tell you their backstory leading into the title game with North Carolina. No, I have not heard the complaints it's to this school or that school. You kind of go where the results lie, and if Duke wins 10 and 13 years, what are you going to do? You got to tell the Duke story. And so episode 9 is very heavy Duke in the first half. It's the 5 in a row. And then the next segment is about JJ Redick. And it should be about JJ Redick. He's the all-time leading scorer in ACC tournament history. We need to tell his story. It's actually a really good story. He did a great interview. But then the episode turns, and it's Tyler Hansbrough and Roy Williams. And then we find that entry point to do Clemson. We wanted very much to do the mix of different, stories. And I give you an example. Sometimes we made choices, like in episode 5, we leave out Carolina 77 completely, because it was a rematch with Virginia. We just did Carolina, Virginia in 76. It's like, we need to do Phil Ford freshman year. Right. We need to do Wally Walker in Virginia in 76. We got to do Duke when they turned it around with Gene Banks and Spanarkel and Jaminski in 78. And then I think we got to do the 80 final because it's arguably the most controversial final in ACC tournament history against Maryland when Kenny Dennard undercuts Buck Williams. Yeah. So it's like, something's got to go. And it was Carolina, Virginia 77. So I have no problem when we need to cut Carolina, cut whoever. There's times where you just got to make choices. And, every school would face it at some point, I think. And then you really, like, as storytellers, you just, I go back now and I go, God, I'm so glad Wake Forest won a couple in 95 and 96, because it just makes for such a good story to break it up. And you go down and tell Dave Odom's story and Randolph Childress, and Tim Duncan, and it just makes for such a nice story at the right time in the narrative. So I honestly, we all would kind of run to the different stories and schools to break it up, because there is so much Duke and Carolina, because they've been excellent for the most part for decades. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about Clemson. Am I right in remembering that maybe 15 years ago, when the ACC came out with their 50th anniversary squad, that Michael Jordan was named the greatest player in ACC history over David Thompson? I don't remember that. You might be right. I just, I do not remember that. Okay. Would you care to weigh in on that particular controversy, being, being both a Maryland and a Carolina guy? Yeah. I would just say this, just kind of like Michael became an original. Well, David Thompson was the original who Michael looked up to and I think wanted to be like when he was growing up. So, that would surprise me. As great as Michael was, Michael is amazing. But David Thompson was like a total game changer for the conference. Right. What he was doing at NC State. The conference had never seen a player like him before. So to me, David Thompson is an original in that way. And, you know, they're both amazing players. Let's just leave it at that.
Sure. All right. And Brad's backing up my memory here, saying it's true, and that Jordan actually felt bad about that. Yeah, that seems appropriate. Hey, I'm wondering, and this is probably the last question that I'll ask you. What are you working on now? What can we expect from, or what do you hope to work on in the future? Everything you're touching these days seems to turn to gold. So, what's coming next?
Well, yeah, I have been so immersed in this, you know, among some other projects, that, you know, I am just, you know, trying to enjoy the ACC tournament project reaching its conclusion. But I've been working on a big project for Title IX, the 50th anniversary of Title IX, called 50/50, that will be coming out in June.
Right, that's the anniversary.
We're doing a lot of content. We got a 4-part film, another 3-part film called Dream On, a film called 37 Words. So we're doing a lot with that. I've been working on content for the 75th anniversary of the NBA, which is going on right now.
Yep. A
series called Connected. We bring a current player, a current star together with a legend, with somebody, you know, one of the greatest players in the game's history. And we got a special on the 75th anniversary team coming up at the end of May. So, you know, and I'm dreaming up the next big projects. You know, I feel so privileged to be at ESPN. It's a dream come true for me to be able to do a project like this, and you know, to pursue your dreams that you had when you were a kid. You know, to be able to follow the ACC my whole life, love ACC basketball, then dream up a project one day like this, and then have it happen. Like, that's a fantasy. You know, that you talk about Disney World. This is Disney World for me, you know, to have dreams come true. And it is the fulfillment of a lifetime dream for this project to fruition, to happen, and to see the way people have responded has been just incredible. And, you know, so going forward, I continue to be an EP on 30 for 30 films and other projects that we do. And I pursue new special projects that I think are going to cut through and make a difference. And so I'm already looking ahead to 2025 and 2026 and 2027 right now. Wow. As we finish up this project.
Oh, I got to say, I can't wait to see the one on Title IX. There are so many misconceptions about Title IX out there. So I'm really interested to see that treatment. I think what I want to do is what I normally do when I do something for the New York Alumni Association. I turn it over to the #1 Tar Heel fan that I know, that's David German. And I always give him, I mean, this guy travels to Florida to watch UNC football games. That's how serious he is. So I want to turn it over to David and see if he has one final question that he'd like to ask.
Not a question, but just a comment, just to say how terrific this documentary is. I've followed the ACC for many, many decades, and it had to be a challenge just to put this documentary together because there were so many incredible stories. And what do you put in? What don't you put in? And I just think it just really captured the ACC in its true essence beautifully. So thank you so much for this. And I think I speak for all viewers of all schools who I'm sure feel the same way. So on that note, I think we'll wrap things up as it's a little bit after 8 o'clock. And I want to thank everyone. What a terrific turnout we had tonight, which is just fantastic. And I just want to say thank you to John. Thank you to Matt for a really engaging session this evening. I'm sure you'll agree with me. The tournament truly captures what makes the Atlantic Coast Conference the best conference in the history of college basketball. And this documentary is one that fans are going to take pleasure in for a long time. So everyone, thank you all for joining us, and have an enjoyable remainder of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Good night, everyone.